So we're going to talk about some artifacts from Assyrian and Babylonian cultures. What you see here, this is Israel, and I believe the map maker on this one was French, and I just borrowed it. So you have Damascus up here, this is Tyre, there's Byblos I've talked about. Byblos is Canaanite, Tyre's Canaanite. Here you have Jerusalem. And Haran, if you recall, when Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, and his father's name is Haran, and he came up to Haran, and he was there for a time. If you ever have time, go on the internet and look up Haran, and the buildings there are so incredible, and this was like a crossroads of commerce in the ancient world. But the buildings are very conical shaped, and the reason for that is because of the heat. And once you go inside, the heat will rise up in these cones and go up to the top, and it actually makes the living conditions much more cool. So over here you've got Nineveh, there's a town called Asher, and then other sites that were built by each of the kings kind of like started a city. But Asher in Erech or Akkad, this area is called that. Now, going back to Nimrod, he is the first king of this area, according to the Assyrian records. Gilgamesh is the first king. We talked about that. And then also Babel or Babylon, and then Ur down in this area. And then you've got the Persian Gulf right there. Early Assyria was in this area, and what happened, being here in this area, the Fertile Crescent, they had invaders that would come through and raid and get their crops and these things. So what's called the Neo-Assyrian period, they restructured, and the kings hired, or they had a professional army. And the Egyptians had armies, and you read about armies of the Greeks, and until you really had professional armies, the fighting was really done by people that were just regular farmers, agricultural work and things like that. And they would practice from time to time warfare. But the Assyrians developed an army and trained an army to prevent these raiders from coming in. Well, it worked. And once they didn't have the raiders coming in anymore, they had this paid army. And they looked around and said, well, we might as well use this army to do things, you know. And so so about that time is when, you have the northern 10 tribes of Israel, that they've never had a good king all the way through. None of their kings are any account. Jehu comes close, but then he flips. And so God uses the Assyrians to eventually they won't repent, the children of Israel, and he uses the Assyrians. He uses the Syrians first, and then in the end the Assyrians come down and conquer all of this area down to Judea. And the way they would conquer peoples is they would take these peoples and then move them over to the opposite side. They would be in an area where they didn't have allies, they didn't have the same languages, and then they would take the peoples from over here and then bring them in. And if you are reading in the book of 2 Kings, and you will read that the people they bring in that are foreigners, and they bring them into northern Israel, and when things go bad, they will say, well, it's because the God that was here over the land of the Israelites is against us. And you'll read, and I can't think of the particular instance, but they will search for priests. Jason might help me with this if he recalls, but you kind of know which ones I'm talking about. But if you read through 2 Kings, when the Israelites are carried away, they are carried away. In the ancient Assyrian records, they know the Assyrians had their eye on, in the northern 10 tribes, they're not just only called Israel, but they're also called Ephraim, and they're also called Samaria. And the Assyrians had their eyes on the Sumerian chariots. I guess at the time, Israel was making some really good chariots of the day, and they had very good and well-trained charioteers. And when I took a course through the University of Munich, the professor said that the Assyrians, when they conquered Israel, automatically integrated the chariot, the Israeli chariot drivers, into their army. And that was one of the reasons they wanted to come down there. So, God works in different ways, but he is over all the kings of the earth. And the Bible tells us that, and God can move those kings in the way he wants to. Remember, it said God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Did he do that literally? No, he knew what would be a stumbling block to Pharaoh. And in fact, the Egyptologist Bob Breyer says to harden Pharaoh's heart is an Egyptian way of thinking. To say that, that someone is stubborn, their heart is hardened. And we probably realize that today because we study the Bible and we see that there. But in the ancient world, that was a common way to say these things. The Assyrian and Babylonian cultures are closely tied. And in the ancient world, they were sort of all together and had very similar. And then you have Sumerian culture here. So, if you recall, Jonah was commanded to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh was a great city. And the Bible describes the size of it. And Jonah tries to flee, and in the end goes to Nineveh, and he preaches, and what happens? They repent, because the king heard and rent his clothes, told the people to repent of their wickedness. And Jonah wanted to see the city destroyed. And he was angry when God didn't destroy the city. But, so God saved Nineveh at that time. And Jesus uses that parallel when he's speaking that Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, and one greater than Jonah is here, and the Jews should have recognized that it was the Messiah. And Nineveh laid buried for just many, many centuries. When the Greeks, there were some Greeks that were mercenaries, and they hired out to the Persians. And the Persians were defeated in battle, so the Greeks didn't have any place to go, and the Greeks that survived the battle had to get back home. And when they came back, and they came through the Assyrian desert, and they came back up this way, they came and they wrote about what they saw, and they were amazed. They said, what culture lived and built these great cities? I mean, these are the Greeks that are looking, and they said, and it was vacated. It was gone. It was gone. And this was probably in the 400 BCs. So to give you a little bit of background there, Nineveh was discovered in the 1800s, actually by an Arab archaeologist. And when they dug down, and if you looked at it from above, like from an aircraft, which they didn't have, if you looked at it from above, you could see out the city walls and everything. But it had been covered over and been farmed over, And when they began to dig down, and the Arabs that lived there said, we have treaded over this ancient city, for generations and not even known. Assyrians thought that, well, in their culture, lions were seen as representing evil, basically a Satan, if you will, or a demon. And so every Assyrian king had a lion hunt. And you can see here, they look pretty staged. And if you go to the British Museum, they just have hallway after hallway after hallway of these things. And some are pretty gruesome, looking at the way that the lions died and the way they were killed. But in the Assyrian culture, if a king could not control evil, he was seen as not fit to rule. So, sort of by pride and arrogance, they had to go and have these lion hunts. And the places and where they would have these lion hunts is the Persian term that's used. We get the idea of paradise from the Persian word, and it is like a beautiful city park that has everything that you need. And these would be enclosed. They would have all types of animals. They would have water abundant, and they would channel the water so everything was watered. And so they called these places like a paradise by the Persian term. And so they would have these lion hunts, I think, most likely in these areas like that. Sennacherib, now after the Israelites have been taken captive and been dispersed, we see that Sennacherib is king of Assyria, and he wants to use his army to go out. And typically the kings went out in the spring and summertime, and it was actually more beneficial to go out into the summertime when many of the crops were being harvested, and then they could just take the grains and things like that. When the ancient cultures conquered area, they didn't occupy the area. Let's think of it as a football game. And so here you have different cities around you, and there's like a dominant city that just wins every football game every year. And so they would go and destroy a city or really come down hard on the people. And then they would set up either their own governors, or if the king is left over that they conquered, they would say, okay, this is what we want. We want 50% of your crops. You send 50% of your crops every year. It's sort of like Bug's Life in a way. Did you see Bug's Life where the grasshoppers are telling, yes, where's our food? And so it was an easy way to manage things. And so when you see in the scriptures, when a king rebels against the king of Babylon or the king of Assyria, they're not paying their tribute. They're not paying their taxes to that. And what is going to most likely happen, they're going to send an army. Now, Jerusalem was far enough away, they didn't live in fear that they were going to make that long journey down. When Hezekiah, so you have Uzziah, and then you have Jotham, and then you have Ahaz, and then you have Hezekiah. Uzziah, Jotham, and especially Ahaz. When you go and you look at the old archaeology there, you can see that there are some Assyrian architecture left over that they can still find, that the Assyrians built some gates around some vineyards and things like that. And when the grain coffers that they discovered, the seals on them either have the name of the Assyrian king or the name of the Egyptian king or Pharaoh. And when you get to Hezekiah, they don't find anything like that. Hezekiah is, his own seal is on all the grain coffers that they find. So you see that the three preceding kings were paying tribute to Assyria and to Egypt. When Hezekiah comes, Hezekiah says, no, and he doesn't. Sennacherib then comes down, and it says that he captured 46. The Bible says he captured the fortified cities of Judah. He gets as close as Lachish, and he goes back home later and puts a scene on his wall, which I've got a picture of over there, of the destruction that he does to the city, but also skinning the city leaders alive and then impaling officials outside the city walls. He writes about that, and there are 3 of these prisons, and this one is in Jerusalem, and it was acquired. They don't know where it was found. It was never fired like you would do your pottery, and it was never fired, and so it's had some damage, and it's probably going to come apart at some point. Then the best one actually is the Taylor Prism. The British, when it was found, understood that it should get fired, and they fired it so it would be preserved. And then the one at the Oriental Institute, and they changed the name of that recently. These 3 are almost parallel in what they say. He talks about the cities. He talks about he went up, tried to, I think it was him, tried to locate the source of the Tigris River, and then comes down and he goes towards Judea, and it was because Hezekiah rebelled. And so when you read Isaiah starting in chapter 36, going through 38 there, and that parallels exactly to the passage in 2 Kings of the same event. And he says, that I had Hezekiah like a bird in a cage in its royal city. That's as close as you'll get to a defeat by an ancient king. What God does is he tells Hezekiah, Sennacherib will not set foot, he will not build a ramp, and he's going to preserve the city for the sake of David, for David's sake, because of his promise to David. Then the Bible says God sent out an angel that destroyed 185,000 of Sennacherib's army. Now, an angel, translated, is a messenger. Okay, so there is an Egyptian account where the Pharaoh came up to help later. I mean, it's sort of like, oh, here comes the cavalry just in time. Well, I think the Egyptians came because they had an agreement, and they had allied, or Israel had allied with the Egyptian Pharaoh. And I think he intentionally arrives late to the battle and say, hey, we're here. The Egyptian account of these 185,000 that are dead, they arrive, and so it says that they arrive, and early in the morning they see the Assyrian tents. And so their archers just shoot arrow after arrow after arrow, and the army does not attack, and no one comes out of the tents. And so they come, and the Assyrians are all dead in their tents. And they're kind of like, wow, we did a pretty good job. And we don't know how they died. We don't know if God used the Egyptians really to use it. The Egyptians finally decide it wasn't really all us. And so in their account, it said the rats came down from the hillsides during the night and chewed their bowstrings on their arrows, and they couldn't fight back. And therefore, we won the battle without losing anybody. And, I personally, I think that the soldiers are probably already dead. Had you ever heard that account? Yeah. And so it's interesting how ancient cultures will put a twist to give their god or their king glory. Yes.
What's that old saying? The history's written by the winners?
It's written from the perspective of the victor. And I think if Winston Churchill didn't say it, someone like Winston Churchill said it. If there was no other artifact found except for this, for me, I don't need the evidence, but for me, this parallels so close to the biblical account because, they're always going to put a twist. Ramses the Great, he gave himself the title, or he's known as the Great. And in my opinion, he never won a battle. He came to a lot of draws and was lucky to get away with his life, but when he came back and wrote about him, you would think he was the greatest strategist since Rommel. So here's one of the Hezekiah bulas, or seals, that was discovered on one of these royal coffers. And in pottery, and I don't know if you saw, I don't know if I had an image of the Dead Sea Scrolls since I was here, but if you saw what the Dead Sea Scrolls were contained in, they're about so big. The grain coffers are somewhat similar to that they find. And in the archaeological field, they call them the Canaanite jars, and they're found from Egypt all through Israel, up through Turkey, over to Assyria. And they made these the same for centuries. They're all the same. There's an archaeologist named Flanders Petrie, and he made the statement once that you can date civilizations by their pottery, because we know exact date of certain types of pottery. That's true to a point. I took a course through Oriental Institute in Chicago, and the archaeologist that taught the course on pottery, she said, I wish he'd never made that statement. Because she said, we have people all the time come to us with a piece of pottery, and they say, how old is this? And she said, especially if it's one of the Canaanite jars. And they'll give them a range of like 1,000 years. It could be from, 1,000 BC to 2,000 BC, because everybody made these the same. And sometimes they, would put the handles on. And so then they got a little bit more of a clue. But there were certain types of the smaller pottery that if you found that, yes, indeed, they can date it to that. But some of the larger pieces, it's more difficult. According to Sennacherib's account, and he talks about these things, he says he takes 200,000 people in his campaign out of the Judean area and then relocates them. And on his reliefs, it shows children and women, and they're very emaciated, and they're carrying them off into slavery and to be put probably over where the other Israelites are. But anyway, God saved Jerusalem. Now, keep that, remember that. God saves Jerusalem, the temple, under Hezekiah. When you get to the book of Jeremiah, and God has decided that Judah is going to go into captivity, Jeremiah tells the king to capitulate, because you're going to captivity. And if you capitulate, if you surrender, it will go well for you, but if you resist, it will go bad for you. There's a contradiction right in the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, and it starts in with that event. And has the prophet saying that, you know, if you repent, God will save the city. It's just the opposite of what the account in Jeremiah says. And so you don't have to go very far in the Book of Mormon to see that it doesn't match the biblical account. I don't think they really understand that or notice it or care. But right off, I noticed that in the Book of Mormon when I started studying it. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to remember. This is the siege of Lachish that was on the palace walls of Sennacherib's palace. And if you see there in that hallway, and as you walk through, you see the siege and where the archers are shooting, the Israelites are throwing down flaming torches. They have battering rams that they're using. They have found one of the battering rams on that mound. And so that's really pretty interesting because they found the battering ram. So here you have this account, and it talks in the Bible there about the fires that they could see from Lachish from Jerusalem. And so they knew the city was falling to the Assyrians. This is one of the illustrations of the relief. And so you can see the fierceness and the ferocity of the battle. Well, I guess you can see it better here. So there's a siege engine, and it has a long post, and it was designed to break down the wall. And Lachish was extremely well fortified. It had a big ramp that's probably as high as the ceiling here that went up to the gates. And there was a set of gates you had to go through, and then you went into this area, and there's another set of gates. And then you had to get through that set of gates to get to the main city gate. And so it was a rather fortified area, and you see that the Assyrians had figured out ways to get down the walls. So that's a picture of the city. And what I just described, there's the ramp that goes up to get through a gate, and then there may have been probably another gate right here, and then you had to get in here. So the city is really, and each of these cities had their own governors. And so sometimes when they excavate these cities, you think of them as, oh, they were kind of like their own kingdom. Well, Jerusalem ruled, but each of these places, and it's not unlike the forts of the Old West. You had people that lived in the cities, but there were people that surrounded the outside of the cities, and then when they saw the armies coming, they would get into the cities to fortify that. And that was common throughout the ancient world. This are some of the children and the women and if you can kind of see their rib cages here, and so they starved them inside the city walls before they would start the battle. And so this is a Syrian soldier. So this kind of gives you an idea of how they looked. And then these are some of the city officials that were impaled upon the post. And then these are city officials that were skinned alive. Again, you can see the style of the helmet of the Assyrians. And notice the hairstyles and the beards. You want to know what an Israelite looked like, or a Judean? There you go. And in the ancient world, in the reliefs, if you see an unbearded individual, they're most likely a eunuch, and they probably served the royal court, because they made, if you were going to serve in the royal court, you were made a eunuch. That way you did not have the threat of trying to establish your own dynasty by killing the king. And all ancient courts pretty much did this. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego probably had been made eunuchs. You don't see that Daniel ever married. And so, and again, just like what I told you, you got here. Now, when you get to the Romans, I guess they had better razors, or had razors, but they shaved, starting with Julius Caesar. I think we're going to speak this one. Oh, here we go. This is called the Black Obelisk, and it is made by the king Shalmaneser III. And if you look at it, rotate. So it's four-sided. This artifact is about 6.5 foot tall. The original is in the British Museum, but there were 5 casts made of this when they discovered it. One is in Chicago, one is at Harvard or Yale. Can't remember now which one. And it just chaps me because they have it like holding the door for the cafeteria, so they kind of holds the door open. And I was like, I could put that to a lot better use. And there's also one, and I don't think people know that this exists, except people at the university, and I don't think they really realize what it is. In Salem, in Corbin University, one of the men that I guess started the college, it's a Baptist college, one of their founders was an archaeologist back in the day, and he knew when a lot of these great artifacts were being found, he got a cast. He has a cast of the Code of Hammurabi there. They have a cast of the Moabite stone, and they also have a cast of this. And I went and they let me do a 3D scan of it, and I was trying to get, during COVID, there's a place that has industrial 3D printing machines, and I thought I was going to be able to get a cast or a 3D print of this that's full size so I can take it around so it wouldn't be so heavy. But at some point, I want to get a hold of that. I think they might sell it, I don't know. The lady said, when I was scanning it, because it was kind of dark, and she says, oh, you just move it around wherever you want, just put it, to me it's priceless, and to them, they're just like, what is significant about this? It has the only image of an Israelite that's ever been found. Israelites, Jews and Israelites did not make images of themselves, as in other cultures. The kings did not make images. That was something that I think because of the law of Moses, they steered away from. They didn't make human images. They don't really make animal images, but when they do decoration things, a lot of times it's like pomegranates, leaves, and vegetation, if they do it at all. So if you look here, this big artifact has 5 kings bringing their taxes, their tribute to Shalmaneser. And it's all described here. Everything that he brings is described. A lot of people say, well, I don't think the king would go up there to bring his own tribute. He probably sent an ambassador. There are 3 kings that do have ambassadors that bring their tribute, and they don't attend, but they're very far away. And Ahaz in Judea was required to go, and when he went to the king of Assyria to bring his tribute, on the way back, he goes through Damascus, and he sees an altar there, and then he has it placed and built inside the temple of God. And that's just a side note. So you can see here, this is an Israelite Jew. His name is an English word, and it's defined as one who drives furiously. And you can use it in Scrabble. That's important to know. One who drives furiously, because Jehu drove his chariot that way. Jehu is the one that kills Jezebel and kills all the prophets of Baal. But then once he's solidified his power, he goes astray. This event is not in the Bible, but Jehu is. And here you see, again, eunuchs around the king. You got 1, 2, 3, 4. And this represents the Israelites' tribute that is being brought there to Shalmaneser. This is Assyrian. I think most of you probably have seen this. These priests in Assyria, these are salmon that are caught from the Euphrates River, which used to be quite big, or the people were quite small. But they would catch these salmon and wear them. And in Assyrian reliefs and architecture, you'll see winged preachers or these priests, and they're doing something. They're either harvesting the tree or feeding the tree. They don't know what it is. They don't. The Assyrians never name it in any of their inscriptions. The early archaeologists called it the tree of life because it seems to be something that they worship. And modern archaeologists have shied away from saying that because they might bring in something biblical. These are called apakalu, and it means wise men or sage or expert. And it comes from the Noah character, which is called Adrahasis. And the man that survives the flood in their ancient literature is half fish, half man. And he is the wise one, and he is immortal. Well, Noah lives 350 years after the flood, so they began to think that. The name they call Noah is Utpatistum, and that's in the Gilgamesh epic and story. Now, over in the land of the Philistines, and I've seen some recent documentaries, and they've been placed out on YouTube, and they talk about who were the Philistines, where did they come from. Some people think that they came from Anatolia, up in the Greek area, and came down. But according to the Bible, the Philistines were there when the Israelites came in to conquer the land of Canaan. And so the dates then don't work. They think it was from the fall of the Bronze Age that the Philistines showed up, but the Bronze Age collapse comes after the Israelites are already there. Anyway, the Philistine god Dagon that they have discovered looks like these priests. And the professor, Lorenzo Negro, that did the research there off the coast of Sicily, thinks that Poseidon is the Noah character in the Greek, and he's on both sides. He's the Titans, with the Titans, and he's also with the Olympian gods. And the Titan gods were the gods that they worshipped prior to the flood, and then after the flood they went to the Olympian gods. But what he says is there's a lot of gray area in the way that they worship that we just don't know. And a lot of these gods, there's so much crossover in what they do. But we see here that they have continued to worship elements of the flood, even though in an errorous way. But the Noah character is remembered and revered and worshipped in many of their ceremonial things. Here also is the tree of life, and then you have these cherubim type figures around this tree. And when you think of the Garden of Eden and the cherubim were placed to keep man away from that, it could be some of that lore. Throughout the ancient world, they find images of a tree with a serpent hanging out, and a man and a woman, and going back to the Garden of Eden.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
What's the handbag?
They don't know. They don't know if they're picking fruit or if they are somehow, it looks as if they're picking it.
I watched the YouTube video today of all the handbag, just like that, of their gods having handbags from all over the world. And they're all holding handbags. And they just said, the guy on YouTube was like, what's the handbag deal? He didn't know either.
Well, if you listen today, they think they may have been, it was part of the woke movement.
Yes, well, they got with the back.
Now that's a joke, that's a joke.
That was a man purse.
Now, the Assyrian kings, they have these lamassu on either side of the palace walls. It was believed the lamassu could see into the heart of the individual. If they were evil, they could not pass. Notice Sargon II's have cow hooves. These over here have sort of lion, bird-like claws. They have their faces on these, but then they have their wing. They're like a cattle's body, but then a lion's tail. And if you read Ezekiel, the description there, archaeologists will say these do sound like Ezekiel's cherubims, but they'll say the Jews borrowed the imagery from the Assyrians. The Persians have what they call a sphinx, and it's very nearly identical to these lamassu of the Assyrians. And then this is Artaxerxes. And, you know, when you start talking about Artaxerxes, you're in the time period, you're getting around the time period of Esther and Nehemiah. So to kind of give you a reference there. This is Nebuchadnezzar's, they discovered this, and this is his account of dealing with Jerusalem before he conquered it. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, and I started talking about this earlier, the priests were telling the king and the princes that God protected Jerusalem and would not let the temple be destroyed during the days of Hezekiah. And they said he will do that again today. And so the king was led to believe, he didn't listen to Jeremiah, he was led to believe that God would protect them. Jehoiakim is taken to Babylon and lives his life in Babylon. And then through his seed, you have Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel means born in Babylon. And then he installed Jeconiah's uncle, Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is going to resist, and he's going to end up, his sons and him trying to sneak out of Jerusalem. And the sons are slaughtered before his eyes, and then his eyes are poked out. And so this account here parallels the biblical account. This is the cylinder of Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the king of Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar, and they said that Belshazzar never existed. Well, his name is on this cylinder when they discovered it, and he had left Belshazzar in charge in Babylon. And on this cylinder, he says, "May the god Asher, whose temple I have gone to repair, watch over Belshazzar, and may he be wise." And you see in Daniel chapter 5, he indeed was not wise. He had a big party when Dad was out of town. And then the Babylonian kingdom goes beyond the Assyrian kingdom, and Nebuchadnezzar comes up to Jerusalem 3 times. He didn't want to destroy it, but he's just finally provoked by the Jews that he sends his general there to destroy it. Now notice these early kingdoms do not extend over into Egypt, although they give Egypt some headaches. They do not extend over to that direction. The Egyptians worked with the Babylonians to destroy Assyria, and they sort of make a dividing line there at the Tigris.